So now, without further ado, please let me introduce to you today's speaker, Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster and Senior Vice President of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings. Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos Inside Track webinar, America the Uncertain. We're already in mid-September 2021. The year has been flying by. And as always, we have a lot of data to share with you today. Briefly, I'm going to talk about COVID-19 and the economy, what the Delta surge has really done to the country. Spend a little bit of time talking about back to school. That's actually a major event that's sort of shaping society at the moment. Look at some of the data we have on American attitudes towards the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which dominated the news cycle for the last couple of weeks. And then finally talk a little bit about American politics and particularly President Biden, where he stands at the moment. If at any point you have any questions, don't hesitate to go ahead and put them in using the Q&A option on the GoToMeeting application. You can do that anytime, and I will, as Ellen said, come back to them at the end, try to answer as many questions as we have time for. Great. So first off, main issues. Where are we as a country? The economy continues to be the #1 issue facing the country for more Americans, but we can see that public health, disease, and illness has really jumped up the lists relative to where we were in July. Now, this is basically the Delta variant causing people to sort of return back to that concern, but it's important to remember that it's not just COVID all the time. There are still a lot of other issues that are sort of top of mind for people, including healthcare system, including the environment, including terrorism and immigration, things like that. But the other thing I want to note is that the other topics that really had started to sort of emerge as sort of the main topics of debate over the summer, immigration, crime, and inequality, have all dropped down as a result of the resurgence of Delta. So essentially, Delta has sucked up the public's attention away from these other issues that have been a little bit more political. So let's go into sort of COVID-19 and the economy. Just to level set, we are seeing a pretty significant surge in cases. About 150,000 new cases a day on average. It does look a little bit like we might have seen the peak of the new cases the week before Labor Day, though, you know, with Labor Day holiday reporting, it's always a little unclear. Also with back to school and sort of the restart of sort of major athletic events like football games, in-person football games, I think there is still a lot of question on if we're going to see a continued spike or if the cases are going to continue to come down. Hopefully they do come down. But, you know, we are seeing this spike. The good news is that we aren't seeing necessarily quite as many deaths as we saw in the last COVID spike over the winter. There's still, of course, lots of people who are dying, and it's very tragically. But, you know, because the older Americans are pretty highly vaccinated, we're seeing a little bit less a mortality rate. Now, as a consequence, we're seeing American behavior changing again. We've seen this a number of times over the last year and a half of Americans' response to the pandemic, but it's important to note that the response this time has been much more muted than what we've seen in previous instances. So at this particular moment, as of late August, we'll actually have a new data point on this particular survey from Axios out tomorrow. We're seeing that about half of Americans have, just over half of Americans have gone to visit friends or relatives or gone out to eat in the last week. That's not the highest number it has been. We certainly saw more people in June when we sort of thought everything was past us, when the numbers had gotten up into sort of the high 60s. But you'll notice that on this chart, the number of Americans who are sort of going out certainly is not as low as it was at the beginning of the year when we were in the midst of that winter pandemic wave. And I think that's important to keep in mind that yes, people have pulled back slightly. They have sort of reverted back to a lot of the protective measures like wearing a mask at all times, like social distancing. when you're sort of out and about, but nothing at the levels we saw last year, right? So a lot of the sort of the pullback we're seeing right now is more of a mental pullback and not as much of a physical pullback. And that's in a large part because of that dotted line, which is the vaccination rate. And at this point, we are seeing about 75% of American adults, that is age 18 plus, are vaccinated. Among people who are 12 to 17, sort of that younger teenage group who are eligible, the number is a bit lower. And then, of course, people under the age of 12 are not yet eligible to be vaccinated. So that's the sort of the largest single cohort remaining to be vaccinated. But as this number has continued to climb, this vaccination number has continued to climb, the vaccinated population has continued to sort of go out and about, not necessarily retreat home like we saw last year at the beginning of this year. But like I said, what's really changing from the position is this return to this sort of sense of risk, this sense of concern. And that's really what we're seeing during this phase of the pandemic more than anything. 60% of Americans feel that a return to their pre-COVID life would be risky right now. That's almost as high as the 70% we saw during the winter surge before the vaccine is readily available. So you can see that that level of concern or that perception of risk is similar, even if the actual level of risk is decidedly lower among people who are vaccinated. And most of the data suggests that it is, that the chance of getting COVID once you're vaccinated is about 1 in 5,000. And if you're just sort of going about your typical day, and if you're taking sort of basic protective measures, it's about 1 in 10,000. But you can see that there is this sort of mental sort of concern or this mental sort of anxiety that is really sort of driving a lot of the response we're seeing. And that's carrying over into consumer behavior. This is our consumer confidence tracker, our weekly consumer confidence tracker that we do with Forbes. Consumer confidence, consumer sentiment really hit a high in June, which again was sort of that period where everybody thought they were getting back to normal, and we had that sort of the hot vaxxed summer sort of memes that were going around. And then as the Delta variant has become sort of predominant, we've seen that confidence sort of drop out. But that's not necessarily because people have experienced any real changes to their material good. We're not seeing people losing wages or losing jobs. Instead, it's about people being scared or concerned about what the future looks like. It is about people thinking that they might lose jobs, that they might lose wages, and that's really depressing sentiment, not actual real lived damages, though of course there are people who are experiencing challenges right now. In that same line, we're seeing fewer Americans being really optimistic right now that the economy is going to bounce back post-pandemic. So this is something we've been tracking again since last year, where we ask people, do you think the country is going to recover quickly once the pandemic restrictions are lifted? And should we allow businesses to reopen even if the pandemic isn't fully contained? These two numbers have tended to sort of track together, and essentially higher numbers indicate when people are more optimistic about being able to get back to normal. Lower numbers mean people are more concerned about the public health issues of the pandemic. And we see the same pattern we're seeing in all of the other data, where in late June, early July, we sort of hit a peak. People were very excited, very positive, and then it's come down. And here too, we can see it sort of return, these sentiments have returned back to levels we saw in January, which even though the vaccine does provide a certain significant more protection than people had in January, the levels of concern are sort of similar. So that's sort of the world we're living with, is people are still kind of doing more stuff, but they're equally concerned to where they were pre-vaccine. Now, to get past this, we're seeing sort of the introduction of lots of different policies, but the reality is most Americans aren't actually living in places that have COVID-specific mandates or rules. A little over half of Americans, 54%, say that working Americans say they work at a place where the employee requires a mask. About 40% say they live in a place where the state employees or the local employees have to be vaccinated or wear a mask, and only about 1 in 5 employed Americans say their employer is requiring a vaccine. Now, of course, again, this is data from about 2 weeks ago, just before Labor Day. We'll have a new data point on this out tomorrow. tomorrow with our Axios tracker, and I'm guessing that these numbers are going to have gone up over the last 2 weeks and will continue to go up, particularly as Biden's new announced policy potentially goes into effect. However, when we ask Americans what they support, we do see large support for these sort of anti-COVID, COVID mitigation related policies or mandates, including majority support, 71% supporting wearing masks in schools, close to majority support with a local government mask ordinance, and even majority support among working Americans for employer vaccine mandates. So we do see large majorities, not large majorities, but we see majorities of Americans, large majority in the case of masks, supporting these policies. A lot of the sort of the noise you see in the media of people against it is a sort of very vocal minority, but it is only about a third of Americans who are steadfastly against these things. The majority are sort of in favor. And then when we sort of flip it upside down and we look at places where the state government has actually prohibited mask rules or mask requirements, we see that that's actually not very popular. This is specifically sort of talking about policies we've seen released in places like Florida or Texas, where only about 1 in 3 Americans support prohibitions for mask requirements. That is, that you're not allowed to make a mask requirement, and even fewer believe that the state should actually withhold funds if a local government organization or school district requires masks. That's specifically an example of something that's been going on in Florida. So we can see essentially a picture where Americans are broadly supportive of sort of steps to deal with COVID, even though there is this, again, very vocal minority who are steadfastly opposed. So back to school, speaking of masks in school, we are in sort of a back to school period. Most places we have kids back in school. And we see that parents and really Americans at large are very supportive of the idea of getting their kids back to school. This is from a USA Today survey, Ipsos survey that we did last week, where 70% of parents support sending kids back to school in person 5 days a week. The last year and a half of sort of uneven schooling and homeschooling, I think, has maybe been trying for folks. But parents and Americans at large are kind of realistic, honestly, a little bit fatalistic about the idea, with 65% who believe it is likely that the schools in their area are going to close this school year because of COVID-19. So Americans and parents want their kids back in school, but sort of believe, you know what, even though I want them back, they're probably going to have to close at some point because of the pandemic, right? So that's sort of that place that parents are at, which is sort of reflecting that like conflict everyone is sort of dealing with. Get the kid into school, school's probably going to have to shut down though. And part of the reason we're seeing parents want to get their kids back into school is that they really feel like the last year has been a struggle. 60% say that teachers have struggled to support their children's online learning. 55% think that online learning has caused their children to fall behind. Only half say that their local school district prepared their kids well for online learning during the pandemic. So there is a lot of concern among parents about what the last year's done to their kids' progress, but parents are generally optimistic, 2/3, 67%, thinking that their child will be able to make up for that lost ground. But to do that, they're going to need to be in schools, right? So this is sort of driving some of that challenge, some of that tension between concern about the pandemic, but wanting their kids back in school. But we see parents and sort of adults writ large are supportive of anti-COVID policies. This is from the USA Today survey. And we see a majority of Americans, a majority of parents support masks in schools, either for teachers or for students. We see a bare majority of parents, though a large majority of all Americans, supporting vaccine requirements for teachers. And then parents are about 50-50 on requiring students to be vaccinated. Though, again, we see a majority of Americans supporting student vaccination. Now, that question is a little bit theoretical because, again, kids under 12 aren't eligible yet for the vaccine, but it does suggest that there is certainly some opening for vaccination in schools, but there's definitely support for wearing masks in schools as COVID mitigation steps. And then one other piece of news, and this is back to our Axios survey, is that opposition to the vaccine has actually declined a bit among parents. This is the trend data for parents saying that they're likely to get their child vaccinated. It had been essentially at about 55, 45, 55 likely, 45 not likely for most of the year, but once the FDA announced sort of the approval of the Pfizer vaccine for regular use and back to school started, we have seen a jump in the number of American parents who say they're likely to get their kids vaccinated, up to 68%, only about a third, 31% now saying that they're not likely. And this is really important because remember that block of kids under the age of 12 is the largest block of unvaccinated Americans that remains. It is something like 50 million people. So it is a really large group of people who are at risk. Even if it's potentially less risk, they are still at risk. All right, so 9/11 in Afghanistan. The 9/11 20th anniversary was on Saturday. I don't know if anyone had a chance to see any of the ceremonies, but they were moving. When we did a survey the week before last for the Chicago Council, we found that most Americans remember exactly where they were on the day of 9/11 20 years ago, particularly people over the age of 30 who were essentially 10 years old or older. It's one of those sort of flashbulb memory moments that people sort of remember sort of exactly where they were, what they were doing. But among younger Americans, we see that it's not quite as stuck in their memory. And then, for people under the age of 20, there's 18 and 19-year-olds who are adults who were born after 9/11. Of course, they do not know where they were on that day. But, it is stuck in people's memories, the events of that day 20 years ago. But like the legacy of 9/11 is actually very mixed. Americans don't have a very clear idea of what the 20 years have done since then have done for the country. When we ask about sort of the war on terror that sort of dominated national discourse for 10 years after 9/11 and has continued for the next 10, we see that actually most Americans, the plurality of Americans, say that the country is really about the same in terms of its safety from terrorism now as we were before 9/11, and that there's really not a lot of difference between them more or less safe. They're about equal numbers saying so, which again, I think reflects sort of the very conflicted, very sort of uncertain legacy of 9/11 and then of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars that followed. Speaking of Afghanistan, that's also a place that's a little bit conflicted because Americans' opinions of it are a little bit conflicted because we see that a majority of Americans continue to support the idea of withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, but very few comparatively are happy with how it was done or happy with how the Biden administration handled that. We see essentially 2/3 of Americans support the withdrawal. Only about 2 in 5 support how Biden did it. We can see that Biden loses substantial ground among Republicans. He loses a little bit of ground among Democrats and independents. And this has been, a major source of news for the last couple of weeks is that withdrawal from Afghanistan and criticism of Biden's handling of it. But the idea that we were withdrawing is still actually sort of where America wants to be. And, it gets into more sort of uncertainty about exactly what America's role was. We ask Americans what we should have done after 9/11. People are mixed, right? So a majority of Americans think it was right for the U.S. to go into Afghanistan. We see about 72% say that it was right to go into Afghanistan. About a quarter say we shouldn't have ever gone there. So a quarter people say we shouldn't have been there in the first place. But then among that sort of 2/3, 3/4 who support going into Afghanistan, they're sort of evenly split between blocks who think that we should have gotten out soon after we went in versus a group of people who thinks that maybe we should have stayed there, still be there even, in fact, sort of the anti-terrorism versus nation building thing. And this reflects sort of the incoherence of American attitudes towards sort of the effort in Afghanistan, and one of the reasons why Americans, generally speaking, support the withdrawal. when we ask Americans if they thought that the war was worth it, at the moment, most Americans say it was not. This is the kind of thing that honestly will probably change as sort of it becomes more history and less immediate. But at least at the moment, right after the withdrawal, most Americans did not think that the war in Afghanistan was worth the cost to the United States. Likewise, Americans don't think that we did a lot of the objectives that were listed out over the year regarding Afghanistan, except for sort of justice for 9/11. All the other sort of reasons that were given, most Americans don't believe were met. However, in one legacy of the war in Afghanistan, we do see large majority support for resettling Afghan refugees, resettling people who worked with the United States while we were in Afghanistan to the United States. Majority support for that, 69%. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people are sort of broadly rethinking America's attitudes towards refugees or immigrants, because only 40% think that we should, broadly speaking, raise the number of refugees allowed into the US every year. So sort of Afghanistan is a little bit of a special case. And it's a special case primarily because people feel like we owe these people something for what they did while we were there. So among the people who support resettling Afghans to the United States, 59% say that we should do so because they helped us and we owe them. Along with sort of another sort of big chunk who sort of believe that taking in refugees is sort of an American principle or part of our moral obligation. Among people who are opposed to it, there's sort of an even split between sort of a fear of terrorism and sort of just the more general idea that the United States can't take anyone else in. So that's sort of what's driving attitudes about Afghan refugees, which are, again, sort of a special case in American attitudes towards immigration. All right, so American politics, last section, then we'll get to questions. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to use that Q&A field. Biden. So Biden's approval ratings have really sort of taken a hit over the last couple of weeks. He had been enjoying approval ratings in the mid to high 50s through most of the first part of his administration. Certainly he was in sort of the higher sort of section of that range through the spring when the vaccine effort was rolling out. But over the last few weeks, really since sort of mid-July, his approval ratings have really taken a hit. And I think that is sort of timed to go with sort of the Delta surge of the coronavirus and the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And essentially at the moment, Biden's approval rating is essentially treading water that is equally favorable and unfavorable, or approve, disapprove, which is certainly much worse than he was. It's not quite as bad as where Trump's approval rating was through most of his administration, which was usually underwater. That is, more people disapproved than approved, but it's definitely a far cry from the levels of support he enjoyed earlier on in his administration. And that's happening across sort of the board. When we ask about views of Biden's handling across a number of issues, they're sort of a little bit weaker. But I think most important is to note is his handling of coronavirus or COVID-19. 55% of Americans approve, 39% disapprove. It's still a net positive score, but it's much less positive than it was a few months ago. And I think that's one of the big things, is that had always been essentially, he's even said himself, you know, that's what he was hired to do, was to deal with the pandemic. And with the Delta variant and the surge that we're seeing in cases, people are feeling like the pandemic's not dealt with, and they're sort of blaming him a little bit for that. When you add that into Afghanistan and people being disappointed with his handling of that, and everything else, it's pulling his standing down, pulling his approval rating down. Indeed, here you can see his numbers on COVID, and just as recently as June, right, which, you know, 3 months ago, 2/3 of Americans thought he was doing a good job handling COVID, but we can see in July that starts to come down. That's as Delta had really started to sort of emerge in sort of Florida and the South. And then 55% in mid-August as sort of the Delta variant sort of really came out across the country. And this has been his, again, strongest piece of his positioning is on COVID, and losing ground here is essentially means he's essentially losing his flotation device. He's losing his life raft that keeps his overall approval ratings up. And without sort of that strong stance, everything else is kind of pulling him back a little bit. So that's what we got. Again, there is a lot of additional research that we're doing. We're releasing a ton of new polls every day. I encourage you to check them out at ipsos.com/news and polls. You can follow our Axios coronavirus tracking, which comes out every 2 weeks on either Axios or our website. Our Reuters political tracking comes out every week. Likewise, all of our sort of other research tools. So at that, if there are any questions, I encourage you to punch them into the system, and let me see if I can. All right, so first question, how are Americans going to respond to Biden's new vaccine policy? So if you aren't aware, President Biden announced a new policy late last week where essentially all employers in the United States, that is every business that has 100 or more employees, are going to be required to have their staff be vaccinated or have their staff undergo weekly tests for COVID. And essentially they're going to use basically employer safety like OSHA to sort of enforce it. There's a lot of sort of details about exactly how it works that I'm not necessarily the expert on, but essentially employers with 100 or more employees, you got to be vaccinated or you got to go under weekly tests. We don't have data on it yet because this was announced again late last week, but we will actually have data on it tomorrow. It's going to be in our Axios release that'll be coming out tomorrow. I can tell you just, between you, me, and the wall, that the numbers for that actually look pretty similar to the support for a lot of the other anti-COVID policies that we've seen, with sort of majority support in favor of the new Biden administration policy. But stay tuned tomorrow for the actual data that will be coming out. Let's see, what's next? So next question is, when the Delta variant finally gets passed, are we going to see people sort of return to the confidence, the exuberance that we saw earlier this summer? That's a good question. And that's one that we can't necessarily answer. There's not a crystal ball. But I would say chances are yes, because again, we haven't necessarily seen that material damage to people that we saw like last year when there was the wholesale job losses. And I do think there is still a lot of pent up demand for people to sort of get out and about their life. I don't think it's going to be quite the jump we saw earlier this year because, again, people haven't withdrawn as much, right? So they're not going to be coming back from as much of a stop. They're already sort of moving a little bit. But I do think once Delta sort of gets down, we will see confidence resurge, bounce back up, and potentially see sort of consumer behavior sort of bounce back up with it. Any updates on the debates over infrastructure? So yeah, it's always infrastructure week is sort of the perennial Washington, D.C. joke. American attitudes towards infrastructure have remained remarkably stable. Americans support the idea of investing in roads and bridges and high-speed internet and water and sort of all of the other sort of hard infrastructure things. They're a little bit more lukewarm about sort of soft infrastructure that is, like long-term care, things like that, but are, more supportive than not. And Americans continue to be supportive of taxing businesses and the wealthy to pay for it. But when you call it the Biden jobs plan, you see that divided partisanship that we see across the board, right? So the same individual who says, yeah, I'm for building all this stuff may be against the Biden jobs plan when it's called the Biden jobs plan, because partisanship, right? The American public hasn't moved on the issue. The American public's in the same place, but the politics of it, because again, that partisanship has such an important factor, remains a little bit muddled, and we're not sure when and if it's going to finally get moved out of Congress and into law, because it's also getting mixed into this larger reconciliation budget package that the Democrats are trying to use to sort of pass a lot of their other parts of their agenda. So in terms of policy, it's unclear, but the American public wants it. That continues to be true. Next question. So this is actually sort of related to something that was in the refugee section, but is this sort of change in attitudes towards refugees similar, or rather going to trigger a change in attitudes towards immigrants or refugees writ large? And probably not. The answer is probably not. I think that people are viewing Afghanistan and Afghan refugees as a little bit of a special case. And indeed, in this survey, in the same survey with NPR that a lot of this data comes from, we actually asked if people support or oppose allowing refugees in from Africa, from Central America, and from like Syria and Libya, and support for those refugees was much lower than the Afghan refugees, 20, 30 points lower, which suggests that, you know, people are viewing Afghanistan again as a sort of a special case, and it's not necessarily changing pre-existing attitudes towards immigration or refugees, which have been sort of a major factor of American society. But when it comes to Afghan refugees, we do see majority of support across both sides, Republicans and Democrats, for bringing them to the country and resettling them. So, you know, there's that. All right, last question I have at the moment, and again, if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in. Will Biden's approval rating rebound if he's able to deal with the pandemic? Again, that's something that's unclear. I think if we see his numbers on handling COVID come back up, that will probably help draw his overall approval rating up. Likewise, the further we get from Afghanistan, I think the less it's going to depress his numbers, but he's probably seen some of this damage is going to last. So he's, you know, he had gotten to 55, 56% job approval of the country approving of his job. You know, as recently as sort of late spring, he's probably not going to get back to those numbers. He may get back to 51, 52%. But, you know, I think some of this damage is going to last. And that tends to be the case for presidents where, you know, typically the damage tends to last a lot longer than the positive stuff. Now, there's, of course, could be some sort of very positive event that happens that causes his approval rating to come up. You know, the economy really booming once we do get past Delta, things like that. And, you know, if you can remember back to Clinton and sort of the late 90s, saw his approval rating actually really rise because of the economic boom we saw in that period, even during sort of the Lewinsky and the you know, Whitewater and everything else scandals that had happened in that part of the political calendar. The economy had helped sort of pull that up. So, I mean, yeah, it's possible Biden's approval ratings are going to come back up, but that's more of a long-term play. In the short term, you know, he's probably not going to get too much more positive, though maybe a little bit. Another question, is there noticeable public concern about Lambda and or the Mu variant, Mu, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, variant of COVID? Not yet. Honestly, Americans haven't been that super aware of the other COVID variants until they essentially become sort of dominant in the United States. So, so not yet, and I think it really becomes sort of a question of like, does Lambda or Mu become sort of dominant variants in the United States, in which case Americans will care about it, but until then, it's sort of more of an edge thing. Has Ipsos done a comparison of sentiment during the end of Vietnam to the end of Afghanistan? Does data on those two periods exist? We have not. That's a great question. There is some data, certainly not Ipsos data. We were founded in 75, I think. But there is like Gallup did data collection back then. So yeah, so it exists. We haven't done it, but I think that's a great question. That'll something I'll look into. All right, so that's all the questions I have in my screen. So thank you again for joining. The next one of these webinars is going to be November 3rd. So please join us then. Until then, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's webinar. As mentioned earlier, a recording to today's presentation will be coming out by email. And of course, in the meantime, if you have any more questions, please do send them to us. We're always happy to respond. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.